Welcome to Hill Country Homilies, weekly homilies from Holy Annunciation Orthodox Church in Liberty Hill, Texas. Holy Annunciation is an old calendar Orthodox church, sharing the faith of the apostles and the love of Christ with all who seek his truth. Now let's listen to this week's homily.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Christ is risen.
He is risen.
Christos anesti. Christos voskresi. Christo ha resuscitado. Today is the fifth Sunday of Pascha. We've passed the feast of mid-Pentecost, and now we approach Ascension. Sadly, we won't have our brothers from across the country gathered with us this Ascension, but hopefully next year we'll all be together again. But before Ascension arrives, we remember the encounter between Christ and the Samaritan woman, the woman at the well. This woman is known to the church as Saint Photini, Svetlana in the Russian tradition, and she is a beloved saint, known not only for this encounter in Scripture, but for her family's great service to the church, because having encountered Christ and having received his revelation that he was the Messiah when he said, "I am he of whom you speak," Saint Photini reformed her somewhat profligate way of life and became a pious woman, and with her family, great evangelist for the faith, ultimately becoming a martyr during the reign of Nero around the year 66 AD. Today, I want to speak about a small part of Christ's encounter with Saint Photini and how it is still important today. In fact, not just still important, let me say vitally important. Given the plethora of groups calling themselves Christian with their diversity in beliefs and practices, I will say this passage is vitally important today. Now, I'm speaking of the part of the conversation between the woman and Christ when she says to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you Jews say that in Jerusalem is a place where one ought to worship." In this statement, she is putting to him a question regarding the schism between the Jews and the Samaritans. This disagreement between the two had both political and religious dimensions to it, and likely predated the separation of the kingdoms of Judah and Israel, even though they both shared the original Jewish blood. And while the history between the two of them is full of slights and provocations and intrigues and deceit, let's focus on the aspect of faith. What did they have in common? Well, both the Jews and the Samaritans believed that they came from the seed of Abraham, that they were the chosen people. And both groups worshipped the same God, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the God ultimately revealed to us as the Holy Trinity. And both considered Moses to be the lawgiver and the prophet of God. So what were their differences? Well, the Samaritans only accept the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah, as Holy Scripture. The remainder of the Hebrew Scripture, including the prophets, was rejected. And incidentally, if you were to look at the Samaritan Torah, it has wide variances from the Jewish version. There are a lot of differences between the two, and in fact, the Samaritan version has been found to be more accurate versus the ancient text. But that was one difference. The Samaritans made their sacrifices and they worshipped on Mount Gerizim, which Saint Photini alludes to in the conversation, which says, our fathers worshipped on this mountain. The Jews, on the other hand, considered Jerusalem to be the holy city, and any other site was considered blasphemous as a place to make sacrifices. Finally, the Samaritans considered the Levite priests to be the highest religious authority, while the Jews looked at their various rabbinical bodies as the interpreters of the law. So we have these two groups with common backgrounds, but current division. And this led to a bitter and at times violent conflict between these two closely related people. And St. Photini boldly challenges Christ right up front with this division. But Christ's answer takes things in a direction that she did not expect. He says, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship that which you do not know. We know what we worship, for salvations of the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." Now let that sink in a moment. Jesus, a Jew, the Messiah to the Jews, says to the Samaritan woman that the worship on Mount Gerizim and the worship in Jerusalem will be no more. And that in fact, that time is now, because he's here. And that the true worshipers will now worship the Father in spirit and in truth. Christ essentially says to the woman, your worship is not true. The worship of the Jews is not true. These false faiths will be done away with, and the true worshipers will now worship in spirit and in truth, because this is what the Father seeks. Now, historically, this came to pass. When the Samaritans were driven from Mount Gerizim after many wars, and in 70 AD when the Jewish temple was destroyed. And these false worships, these incomplete worships, these inadequate worships have been replaced by the worship in spirit and truth that Christ decreed to his apostles. It is a worship that is not tied to a mountain or to a city, but it can occur anywhere and everywhere. Why? Because that corresponds to the nature of God himself, who is everywhere present and fills all things. It is a worship that does not make the external act of bringing of sacrifices the essence of the worship, as the Jews and the Samaritans did, but rather that strives towards God as spirit with all the powers of your spiritual being, seeking to know and to love him and to please him. Yet it does not deny the external ritual, as so many people will do today, because the external ritual is necessary and unavoidable. Why? Because while God is spirit, man is not. Man is not mere spirit. We have a soul, yes, but we also are enfleshed with a body. And we worship God with both. And who can condemn this? Didn't Christ get on his knees in the Garden of Gethsemane to pray? Didn't Christ prostrate his face to the ground when he prayed, "Oh Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will"? And who would dare to call this submission to the will of the Father anything but the truest of worship? Did Christ rebuke those who fell to their knees in front of him? Did he reject the entreaties of Mary, the sister of Lazarus, when she anointed his feet and wiped them with her hair? Or even the harlot who did not cease to fall before him and kiss his feet? Did he say, no, only worship me spiritually? No. Worship in spirit and truth is worship in both body and soul, because that is the fullness. It soars in spirit to draw ever closer to God and to earnestly please him and fulfill his commandments. And it humbly falls down before him in body, submitting to his will in all things. This worship in spirit and truth that Christ decreed to his disciples exists only in the church of his disciples. You see, this in this gospel reading. That's why it's vitally important today. There are those who would tell you that it doesn't matter how we worship. They would tell you that so long as you're seeking Christ in your own way, that's okay. We're all on our own journey. And I suppose there's some truth in that, but there's a danger as well. Because journeys can lead us to very different places. And we don't want that. Because, you see, there's only one thing that we can take from this passage today, and that is that worship does matter. The false worships of the Samaritans and the Jews had to be abolished and replaced with the true worship that Christ speaks of. Go back to the commonalities that the Jews and the Samaritans shared. They were both worshiping their understanding of the Abrahamic God, but that wasn't enough. I don't say this to be hateful to anyone that isn't Orthodox. I say it because too often our culture tells us that we have to honor the choices of others. As a side note, there seem to be a lot of choices that traditionalists will make that they don't seem to think we need to honor. But that's not here or there. But they tell us that we have to accept them as equal to our own, otherwise we're being intolerant or bigoted. But that's just not true, and that's not the message that Christ sends here. He tells the Samaritan woman, you worship what you don't know. He doesn't tell her that to demean her. He doesn't tell her that to condescend to her. He tells her that to enlighten her and bring her to the true worship, which, by the way, he did, as is testified to by her sainthood in the church. When we speak of orthodoxy as holding the fullness of the faith, we are in essence saying the same thing to our friends who are raised in mainline Protestant, evangelical, or non-denominational groups. They are striving for Christ, but because they've become disconnected from the historic church, because they've rejected in many cases the traditional external and spiritual means by which we encounter God, they end up worshiping that which they don't know. And it is an utter truth that you don't know what you don't know. Otherwise, you know it. Now, we must be a little like the Samaritan woman. Because what did she do when she met the Messiah? She ran back into town and she said to the men, come see a man who told me all the things that I ever did. Could this be the Christ? And they went out into the city and they came to him and were told later that many came to follow him. You see, I've said many times how much I love our little Orthodox parish here. We have our Greeks, we have our Palestinians, we have our Russians, we have converts of every background and culture, of beautiful diversity of people here. But when they came here, we also shared one thing in common, and that's that we're Orthodox. We simply have to do more for the people around us who are not Orthodox. We have to run into the town and tell them, as the Samaritans did, come see a man who told me all that I ever did. Come see a man who is the Messiah that we've been promised, and let us worship him in the fullness of the faith. Because how does this pastor end? The fields are ripe for harvest, are they not? Look around us. Look at all the people that go to what they call church. Look at all the people that worship their praise worships and their rock bands and all of that. No externals. Well, maybe it's all externals. It depends on what you want to call it. But nothing traditional whatsoever. No connection to the historic church. They don't know what they don't know. And they won't unless we show them. Not with hostility, not with condescension or triumphalism, but with love of our neighbor. Because if we love them, we want them in the church. How could we not? How could we ever want someone we love outside the body of Christ? That's our challenge here. How do we say to those that we love and that we want in the church, come, see a man. Come, could he be the Messiah? Come worship him in spirit and in truth. So brothers and sisters, as we depart today, let us draw deep from the well of living water that Christ has given to us. Let us worship him in spirit and in truth, offering him not only the external worship, which is in accord with our carnal nature, but the true spiritual worship in accord with his divine nature. And let us invite those who are outside his body in, and those who are inside his body but have fallen away back, that we may proclaim with one voice, Christ is risen. In the name of the Father, and Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thanks for listening to Hill Country Homilies. For more information, visit Holy Annunciation Orthodox Church at www.annunciationtx.com. And please join us again next week.